A truly exceptional project. The Steinriegel Windpark was set up at a height of around 1,600 meters, and as such is one of the world's highest wind turbine generator systems. The total value of the individual components in the 10 separate wind-driven generators is about 15 million euros. The entire wind park delivers up to 13 megawatts of power. Since October 2005, when fully operational, some 11,000 households can be supplied with ecologically generated power. Amongst the many challenges in delivering the components, including the telescopic crane with 8 axles, was the transportation of 3,000 cubic meters of concrete and 150 tons of reinforcing iron, as well as laying 85 kilometers of power supply lines and a 9.5 kilometer cable run from the mountaintop to Mürzzuschlag. The rotor blades alone are 30 meters long, and the largest segment of the tower weighs 38 tons, only outdone by the generators themselves, which each weigh 48 tons. On top of this, building this ambitious project in a high alpine region meant exposure to some of the worst weather conditions. Rain and snow not only led to reduced visibility, but worsened the already difficult conditions along the access roads. Wind conditions didn't help. With gusts of up to 140 kilometers per hour, it became impossible to unload some of the components, let alone to start construction. So the weather caused definite delays, especially costly time with reference to the tight schedule for the project, which could only be made up by the full commitment of the highly qualified and dedicated project team. From the outset, it was clear that the Steinriegel Windpark project would place the highest of demands on transportation and construction logistics. Demands which could only be met by very few companies. By awarding this to Prangl, the project was in the hands of Austria's leading company in this field, whose decades of experience convincingly showed that they had the indispensable know-how and highly professional employees for such a project. An important factor in the choice of Prangl was also that they could offer a complete project service, from the road transportation and any storage, to getting the parts up the mountain and erecting the complete wind generator system. This meant that any interfacing problems which might arise could be kept to a minimum, and the whole project smoothly completed. Thanks to the extreme professionalism, the special know-how, and the exceptional commitment of everybody involved, the estimated construction time was reduced from 6 weeks to just 4.5. The transportation took place in several stages. The components of the wind turbine generators were carried from Denmark by road through Germany to Austria on special transporters. After their 1,500 kilometers journey, they were stored in the town of Ratten. The total amount of kilometers traveled would equal 5 times the world's circumference. At the company's secure transshipment centre, near the town's football pitch, the parts arriving from Denmark were unloaded for storage and prepared for transporting up the mountain. This first phase of the plan was characterized by a tight schedule. Particularly important here was the professional and smooth cooperation of the crane and transportation drivers. Delays in the first phase would have substantially endangered the course of the work and of the entire project. Driving the telescopic crane and transporting the components up the mountain was especially challenging. 12.6 kilometers of road had to be coped with in mountainous conditions, with a gradient of up to 22% and with curves of up to 180 degrees in order to ascend 900 meters. In some places, the road was so narrow they had to drive in reverse. In order to assemble a component weighing 48 tons and 80 meters in length, Austria's strongest telescopic crane had to be brought in. It weighs 96 tons. Driving this 19.2 meter long monster with 8 axles up often unpaved roads, along forest lanes with sharp bends, was particularly challenging to man and machine. For the last few meters of the 12.6 kilometers route, a 4-axled heavy hauler had to be hitched to the front for extra power. With the length of individual components limited to 30 meters and the weights to 48 tons, special transporters had to be used to climb the Ratten mountain. The very size and weight of the components meant it would have been impossible to get them up by helicopter. In addition, flying the rotor blades by air in the heavy wind conditions would have presented an unacceptable risk of crashing. Driving up country roads that weren't designed for such a project, with gradients of up to 22%, really did push those responsible to the very limits of human capabilities. Transporting the 30-meter-long rotor blades proved especially tricky. In order to best get round tight corners, avoiding obstructions such as trees, bushes or electricity pylons, the total length of the transporters had to be kept as short as possible. A solution was finally chosen where the rotor blades were left sticking out, 3 meters over the cab and another 5 meters out at the back. In order to stabilize the rotor blades on the transporters, a special construction had to be used, which was designed especially for this purpose by Prangl's CAD department and built in the company's workshops. During the preparation of the route, out of consideration for the local environment, 2 curves couldn't be sufficiently widened to allow the transporters to pass. In these spots, ramps were built. The transporters drove up these specially built roads, then, changing directions, drove up the rest of the mountain in reverse. This was a challenge to the drivers, demanding full concentration and total control over their vehicles, since up to 1.8 kilometers, including a curve, had to be negotiated in reverse gear. While the problem with the rotor blades was their extreme length, the challenge presented by the generators was above all their exceptional 48 tons of weight. To get these heavy transporters up the hill, an additional 4-wheel drive transporter had to help tow them. While the transporters drove back down into the valley after unloading in order to bring the next parts up the mountain, the assembly team started putting the individual parts together. This was carried out with the help of a telescopic crane with a lifting height of 80 meters and a gigantic counterbalance of 140 tons. Putting up the individual tower components was comparatively the easiest part of the job in hand. It proved much more difficult to mount the 65-meter diameter rotors, consisting of a hub and rotor blades, onto the completed tower once they had been assembled vertically on the ground. This was made especially difficult by the adverse weather conditions. The almost permanent wind, with gusts of up to 140 kilometers per hour, tested the crane driver's skills to the very limit. The decisive factor allowing not only for a smooth running of this extremely complex project, in addition to the professionalism and commitment of the employees, was the meticulous attention to detail in the planning and preparation. Despite time restrictions and adverse weather conditions, It was even completed sooner than estimated. From the very beginning, Prangl technicians were called in and remained intensely involved up to the completion of the project. The first feasibility tests were carried out 4 years before the project's actual commencement, not just to determine whether a project was technically possible, but to answer the essential question of whether the Windpark was feasible at foreseeable costs. The first step was to prepare the often narrow or unsurfaced roads to meet the requirements for the transportation. Special attention was paid to the local environment when preparing the route, with the aim of keeping any interference to a minimum. The road was only widened where it would least affect the local flora and fauna. In 2 curves, which couldn't be sufficiently widened to allow the transporters to pass, ramps were built, which allowed the vehicles to change directions and to drive up to the next ramp in reverse. During the widening of one bend, a stream had to be temporarily rerouted. In addition to this, space had to be cleared up to a specific height. The transporters with the rotor blades were 6.5 meters high, which meant raising the overhead cables by up to 1 meter, and all without any loss of power to the neighbouring houses. Because of the immense weight of the transporters when fully laden, the ground had to be reinforced too. To improve the durability of the roads, gravel was brought in, and in the town of Ratten, one bridge near the storage depot was even given extra supports. The facts and figures for such an enormous project were accordingly impressive, and more than 40 vehicles were involved at various stages. The ambitious Steinriegel Windpark was finally successfully completed on the 2nd of October 2005. The routine of a well-established team, and above all the contracting of just one logistics partner to carry out the planning, the transportation from Denmark to Austria, the storage in Ratten, the special transportation up the mountain, and the eventual erection of the 10 wind wheels even allowed for the project to be completed ahead of schedule. Despite all the adverse conditions, it was a superb technical and logistical performance by everybody concerned in the Prangl company.